Okay, Colin, I think we should start. Aloha, my name is Roger Jelinek. I'm Executive Director of the Hawaii Book and Music Festival. And it's my great pleasure to start this year's program off with this should be extremely interesting panel. I should explain that for the last 3 years, we've been virtual because of COVID. And this is, for us, a fairly modest program. We normally have 12 simultaneous venues and 175 events. But COVID has made it impossible to get this funded at that scale for this year, but we're going to do that for next year, this time next year. But I was determined to celebrate Hawaii writers wherever they are. And today we have writers from New York and California and Hawaii. And I'm just going to start things off by introducing Mindy Pennybacker, who is the moderator. Mindy is a locally famous surfing columnist who has written her own book, which we'll be attending to later in the program. She is Hapa. Everyone else is Hapa. I'm not Hapa. So without further ado, Mindy, would you please go ahead and take it on. Aloha.
Thank you, Roger. I mean, who knows whether you're Hapa or not, really, because the term is actually undergoing it's constantly in flux, like other words. I mean, because most of us, like you might be Scottish and French or something, or even German, right? Those are all really different cultures. Okay. It is my great pleasure to introduce these two new authors from Hawaii. Jasmin Iolani Hakes was born and raised in Hilo. She's the author of a debut novel called Hula. She started studying hula at age 4 at Halau o Kekuhi and helped pay for her college education by performing Tahitian dance at Hotel Luau. Her essays have appeared in the Los Angeles Times and Sacramento Bee. She's the recipient of numerous fiction awards, most recently a Hedgebrook residency, and lives in Southern California with her partner and daughters. And then we have Jessica Machado. Is it Machado?
Machado.
Machado, sorry.
It's okay. Even on the audiobook, they said my name wrong. It's fine.
One of my classmates was pronounced another way. So an Oahu native who grew up in Makakilo and Kalihi, now lives in Brooklyn, New York with her husband and son, and works as an editor at NBC News. Jessica's work has appeared in the Washington Post, The Cut, Vice, BuzzFeed Elle, and elsewhere, and Local is her debut memoir. All right, so the theme of this session, chosen by Roger, who has impeccable instincts, is called Growing Up Hapa. But as we looked into it, the writers and I realized the word means different things to different people and is somewhat controversial nowadays, as people of Asian, Caucasian descent growing up on the mainland and even in Asia and Europe have adopted, or should we say misappropriated, this Hawaiian term. There are times when it feels like identity theft, says Keala Lokahi-Losh, a professor of Hawaiian studies at Iolani Community College, in a recent Facebook forum. So according to the definitive source, Mary Pukui Kavena's Hawaiian Dictionary, Hapa means of mixed blood, person of mixed blood, as Hapa Hawaii, part Hawaiian. But Hapa Haole usually means half Hawaiian, half Haole, not Asian. So if you don't mind my asking, Jessica, what is your racial ethnic heritage, and why didn't you think of yourself as Hapa growing up?
Yeah, so my mom was Haole. She was from Louisiana and moved to Hawaii in her 20s. And my dad was Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian, and Portuguese, or Portuguese, as we all say in Hawaii. And so he was a very local boy. My mom was not. And And yeah, to me, growing up again in the 80s and 90s and going to school in town and going to a private school, Hapa was half Asian, half white. Like, I mean, because a lot of the kids at my school were Asian or white. And then there were some, and then my friends and I were mixed, right? Like I had a group, it was one of those things I didn't even think about until I was much older, when I thought about like, oh my God, we were like the mixed kids. We were the kids that weren't local Japanese or just local Haole, you know? And so, yeah, I didn't, but I really didn't think of it as being Hawaiian, which is like wild, you know, which again says so much about what was lost about Hawaiian language and the way we understand Hawaiian language. Even as somebody who is Hawaiian, like I didn't know to call myself that. But now I don't know if even though I understand the meaning now and it fits, I still feel funny about it, to be quite honest. When people ask me what I am, I mean, I'll spew all the nationalities, but I'll also just say I'm mixed.
And Jasmin, what's your heritage, if you don't mind my asking? And did the word Hapa figure much in your consciousness growing up in Hilo?
It's interesting because I'm listening to Jessica and I'm nodding because I was always very aware of the word Hapa. We used it all the time, but I never applied that to myself either. And I think part of it was, I will just, even now, I'll just tell people I'm a sugarcane mutt. And that's how I've always described myself. And I never really, and then if they really want to know, I'll go into the dissertation about the history of like all the immigrants that came to Hawaii, you know, to work in the sugarcane. And that was kind of sums me up. But I think I was always very self-conscious of looking very Haole. My dad is Haole. He came from California to Hawaii. My mom is very, very local, but I'm the only one in my family that looks white, you know, and they were a mix, or my family is a mix of Puerto Rican, Filipino, Portuguese, all the things. And my grandpa would always say we were Hawaiian, but it wasn't on our birth certificates for blood quantum. Like at some point, somebody internalized that it was just a small amount, whatever. And so I always kind of felt like that disqualified me. I was always very conscious of not having that listed, although nothing is listed on I'm just a mix, you know. And so for me, I think internally, as much as I did see at school, they would refer to Hapa as like Asian Haole. For me, Hapa kind of, I think, meant part Hawaiian and then part whatever else, you know. And so I don't think anybody else disqualified me from that term, but I disqualified myself, and I still wouldn't. And I don't know why I wouldn't call myself that. I guess it's just become a very loaded thing, like a lot of other words.
Well, both your books really focus on the dispossession of Native Hawaiians from their culture and their lands, and in many ways their identity. And the Hawaiian Homes Act of 1920, of course, said that Hawaiian people who could prove they were of 50% Hawaiian descent could qualify to be beneficiaries to have some land restored to them. And we'll revisit that. We'll deal with this in a bit later on, but also it's interesting that, you know, I feel like your family was cheated out of their Native Hawaiian heritage by not having it on the birth certificate of your grandfather, for instance. And I mean, Jessica knows she's Hawaiian, but also it's not on her grandfather's birth certificate.
Well, and it's an interesting thing because in school, like we would always talk about it, you know, at home, and people would say, oh, well, so-and-so has it on their birth certificate, but they're not. You know, there was a time where it didn't, it wasn't paid that much. Like you could get away with either putting it on or taking it off. And there was also a time, as a lot of people know, that in Hawaii, if you were Portuguese, you got a work contract and you got land. You didn't get that if you were Hawaiian. It meant a different thing to list things on your birth certificate, you know? And so it didn't mean what it didn't have the importance. Like my grandpa, my great grandparents, my great great grandparents, like my great 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 grandma was born in like Hula, which is this tiny little town in North Kohala, and she wasn't thinking she wasn't Hawaiian. I can imagine, it wasn't a thing. You were a part of Hawaii and the generation since. And I don't know if I started feeling those things and that sensitivity because of how dramatically different I looked from the rest of my family, or because I grew up in Kilkaha, which was a very dramatic. Here are the tourists and here are the locals and here's me, or just the changing of the times, or a mix of the three.
Yeah, I would say, it's interesting, right? So same, right? Like my my grandpa and my dad, right? Like, it's on like in my grandpa's generation, it's on like one uncle's birth certificate and another one's, but like not my grandpa and then not my dad. And then, but I understood that, yes, it was like proximity to whiteness was like more important than it was to be Hawaiian during a certain period. And then, it took me as like a person who moved away and like lived some life and did some research and like thought about it a little bit more as to why that was, because when I was growing up in the 90s and 80s, it was cool to be Hawaiian. And it's like you almost, again, because we don't talk about our histories enough in Hawaii, like I didn't understand like with the disconnect between that. And then you realize, like my grandpa grew up in this one generation, and then my dad grew up and the Hawaiian Renaissance happened in this, the late 60s and early 70s, right? And so he was somewhere in between. But then in our generation, we watched like the centennial of the overthrow, like we watched, activists walk to like Iolani Palace, like it was like a very different feeling and public embracing of it while I was growing up. But yet again, I also did, to be quite clear, like, was I Hawaiian enough to claim being Hawaiian? I also, because it wasn't emphasized in my family, right? Even though we were, and it was like, I was like, when I went to UH, right? I was like, oh, I'd love to take, Hawaiian language. I'd love to take Olelo Hawaii, but like, I was like, am I going to look like an outsider in this class? Am I going to fit like it, which is wild, right? I even the same thing about going to Kamehameha. It was like, well, we can, even though it's not on my birth certificate, right? There's enough people in the family I could get in. And, but I remember thinking, I don't know if I want to go there because I don't know if I'll be Hawaiian enough. And again, like that, I mean, just like, it's such a disconnect because that's literally, it's like the point of something like Kamehameha or like Hawaiian language, like studies, is that you like for people like us, like, or for people who feel that disconnect, to be reconnected to our culture as well, right? Not to like continue to lose it and, blend into white society,
And I think that was what was infuriating to me, was I was given, like a lot of kids from Hawaii, you're named because of a prophecy or a dream or something like that, right? And so my middle name was given to me and named after Iolani Luahine, and that was such a big name to carry, and I knew that all my life, the weight of that. I had a picture of her on the wall every time I left my house. But even at 4 or 5 going into the halau, looking the way I did and watching myself do these moves and comparing myself with other people, it was like, can I be here? Like, are they all kind of secretly wondering why I'm here? Or, am I qualified to do this? And I think writing Hula was me being infuriated by that, and by the possibility of like, okay, well, what if we are Hawaiian? And what if my grandpa's right, which is probably true? How different would that make everything about my life? How different would it make people who think that I'm just a white person who wrote this book and appropriated the culture or whatever, how different would it make things? And what would change about my responsibility to where I'm from? It's same like with you. It's like, well, like, well, if we don't have a responsibility to this culture, then at some point everybody's going to be disqualified. And then where does the culture, I don't know, that's my rant.
Right. I mean, it's again, like, I mean, it is the project of colonialism, right? It's the project of how we end up with laws like blood quantum, and it's to, I remember reading Hawaiian Blood, and like my eyes were like wide. I could not believe what went down just for like this law. Like, it was like a bunch of people that had nothing to do with Hawaii talking about, well, if they can't, and it was like literally, if you can blend into whiteness, like, like Congress people talking about, well, if they could look white, then they should be fine. And so therefore, like, what makes them, well, what's a good amount? Oh, half. Okay. Like, it was just like,
Even reading out
absurd
loud some of
conversation. Yeah.
the sentences of the Hawaiian Home Act. It's so
Yeah.
pretty,
Yeah. And then it just dawned, and it was that moment where it's like, oh, the way I feel about my identity is by design, like, this is like, but again, I want to be but I also want to be clear, right? Like, there's, my light skin has afforded me lots of things in life too, and it's not like, woe is me, I don't look Hawaiian enough, like, I think it's, it's both, right? And it's also like, I feel like it, even the longer I'm away, I realize I have been away from Hawaii as long as I lived in Hawaii this year. And that is like, woo to me, because I didn't think I'd be away this long. I thought I would come back after a number of years, and my connection to Hawaii feels stronger even than when I was just a kid, like taking everything for granted. But it also, it's also like, there's so much grief about it, about like, there's this sorrow of not living there, and why don't I live there? But then I could do it. I could figure out a way, but no, I still do like living in New York. I still like being away. It's like, there's all these different aspects of identity that make it hard, I think, or that make it complicated.
Sorry, Mindy, we're not letting you ask questions, but I did want to respond one more. You just bring up a good thing about a good point about privilege. I didn't have that word growing up, of what was so uncomfortable about, on top of just the fitting in and everything. But like, my mom and I going places, especially when I moved to California and she would come visit, and the way people treated her versus the way people treated me, I became very aware of that. And it was very uncomfortable because I'd always been so self-conscious about my fair skin, and then realizing, oh, that's why they let me use the employees only back, like just certain microaggressions in reverse type of thing. So I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, it felt like very clear to me. Oh, sorry, Mindy.
No, I just had a quick question. Jasmin, did you mean that you were darker than your mother, so you saw her being more privileged?
No. My mom is dark. And so when she,
I'm sorry, I got you confused.
Yeah. So when she would come to California to visit me, she would be treated like, she would be kind of insinuated that she was like a Mexican laborer or something to that effect, and it was just very, very uncomfortable. And even, in Hawaii, where there was one instance where I was with all the people that I used to dance with, and we were sneaking into the hotel that we worked for to go swimming, and we were all in the pool. And of course, all the security came and asked for our room numbers. And I just said, oh, my parents haven't come yet, so I don't have a room number. And they were like, okay. And then they escorted everybody else out, with like a hand behind their back off the property. And I knew it was because of what I look like. And that was so, so deeply uncomfortable.
Well, I wonder if this might be a good place for us to have you read sections from your novel about childhood, because what Jessica said about her light skin, she realizes gave her privileges that others wouldn't have. And just, all the conflicts we feel about that, just the way you look, earning you something, the presumption from colonial, overlords that the whiter we look, the easier it'll be for us. So no land for you, you'll make it your own way. Sure. So would you like to read those sections about your childhoods? you want to start, Jessica?
Sure. Yeah.
Because it talks about maybe you had some privilege through your coloration, but your parents, they wanted you to have privilege. Every
Yeah.
island parent wants their kid to
Totally.
ascend.
Yeah, and I was lucky, right? But yeah, so this is from the beginning of the book. But when it was just the two of us, no one else around, my mother took a break from seeking connection. She would retreat to her couch spot in the living room, where she'd sit cross-legged with her tray of papers and the remote. It felt like there was a force field around my mother when we were home, that to respect her was to leave her alone, and that only made me yearn to understand and connect with her more. Whatever exciting lives, whatever local lives my parents lived, outside of our suburban home, I didn't know anything about them. I heard about my mother's teaching prowess in her classroom secondhand. My landscaper father never shared his knowledge of palms and fauna, rainwater and sunlight. Perhaps their long workdays left them exhausted and ready to collapse as soon as they pulled up the driveway. Or maybe they had learned through their own upbringings, my mother in a strict Southern Baptist family, my father with parents who argued constantly that home is where you shut down and turned inward, not where you recharged with your ohana. But still, they had certain standards they expected of me, even if they were somewhat contradictory. My parents were both public school educated and barely religious, but they sent me to Christian private schools. My father's tongue was prone to the use of dat and den, but my mother corrected me whenever I spoke pidgin. It's the socks are stinky, not the socks are stink, she said. But my parents wanted me to fit in with those who appeared refined, who could traverse the Western world with ease, who had a familiar set of Christian morals. Meanwhile, what was free and right in front of us went unexplored. Makakilo remains one of the greatest places in Hawaii to view the stars, but my parents and I never sat in the yard or gazed up at the sky. I didn't kick a ball around and never really learned to ride a bike. The brush behind my house was not for hiking. Family trips to the beach were not on the agenda. I didn't develop a hunger for the intricacies of the Aina. I was an indoor kid who avoided dirty fingernails and mosquito bites. I wouldn't take the risk to climb a tree or get on a surfboard. I struggled to understand the carefree fun of my classmates who knew which guavas were ripe enough to pick from the playground trees, or who were eager enough to play games like Chinese jacks, whether or not they were getting good at it. I had to observe and think everything through, only to still hesitate to join in. Even in my own yard, I wasn't sure what to do. The trade winds were the only noise around, and I was scared of the quiet. I learned that silence was where the loneliness resonated. So I made noise inside my head, plays, plots, episodes starring Viva, school scenarios reimagined to go my way. It didn't give the Aina a chance to show me that the sounds of the grass rustling and the minor bird singing could be a comfort.
Thank you. And Jasmin, you're going to read something about your character, main character, Hi'i's childhood in Hilo.
Sure. Another summer of living together old style at Puhi Bay. Hi'i, now old enough to shrug her off her mom, always trying to put off another layer of sunscreen on her or douse her with stinky citronella oil to keep away the mosquitoes, the other kids all laughing at the spectacle until Hi'i disentangled from her mom and went out swinging at anyone within hitting distance. Howley girl, mosquito food, the kids teased. Hi'i slugged one of the neighborhood boys and dared anyone else to call her that. She was as brown as the rest of them, she said. On the inside, she'd lick anyone who said any different. With that, she earned some respect, at least from the boys she'd slugged, and in spite of the hard time the kids gave her, she never wanted to be anywhere else. Her friend Kainoa had an older brother who was training to race. After practice, he'd bring one of the club's canoes from the other side of the bay, and they'd swim out to greet him, hanging onto the outrigger as if they were mer people catching a ride. She ran off when her mom said it was time to go. Laka no longer camped there with us, and he could sense that half the fun happened long after the sun went down, jumping off the rocks with her cousins and swimming out to the deep where she could pretend not to hear her mom calling until Laka got fed up and waited out, he always coming in by the time the water reached her knees. But this year, Laka brought her new man for us to sniff out, and he was hot and cold about it, 1 minute clinging to her and staring death rays at the guy, sticking her tongue out, which earned a flick from her mom, and saying she didn't have a dad and that was how she liked it. Then the next minute, acting like she didn't care, like it was no skin off her back. Laka offered her a consolation prize. He would be allowed to stay just that one night, but it was more rope than he had ever been given before. The girl was happy as a jumping bean. Laka piled on the instructions until a tall white woman wearing what looked like a brand new visor and water shoes, the kind they sold at the tourist fleecing store, appeared out of nowhere. Laka was in mid-sentence when the woman interrupted.
Right. So Laka, Hi'i doesn't know her father, and there's a mystery throughout the book about Hi'i's origins. Laka is a single parent. She's a very fierce, dedicated mother who had gone off to Maui after winning Miss Aloha Hula at the Merry Monarch, carrying on her great family tradition of super kumu hula. And then, comes back with this child who her mother, Hulali, who was a great kumu hula and then becomes a Hawaiian sovereignty activist, just thinks can't be one of the famous Naupaka clan because she looks so white, which is a source of great pain. And then I guess I just Roger wanted me to speak a little bit about my being Hapa, or, and like, I'm a generation older than you two, and I'm half Korean, half Caucasian. And I just thought I was Hapa because the cafeteria ladies at Jefferson Elementary School in Waikiki said I was. Oh, you Hapa. And then, you will Hapa what? And so I said, well, Korean. And I actually might be 1/8 Hawaiian, but that would mean we'd have to admit that one of my Korean great-grandmothers actually went under the fence back in Hawi Kohala around 1904. But what's irked me my whole life is people commenting on my race, in Hawaii or elsewhere. Like there was, when I was 16 surfing one summer, this haole tourist kept following me around. Finally, I yelled at him to bug off. And he just smiled at me with a look of wonderment and said, "Where did you learn to speak such perfect English?" And so then sometimes when I was a senior at Punahou, a haole boy who's going to Harvard, he asked me on a date because he said I suddenly looked haole instead of Oriental. I mean, people just felt free to comment, "You look better now." And then when I was a freshman in college, a male student in my dorm who came from Singapore called me Barbie doll. I guess he thought I looked that howly or something. Strangers would come up to me on campus at Stanford and say, "I look so exotic. What was I, Russian?" So I hate the word exotic. Then both your books deal with the Hawaiian Renaissance of the 70s and 80s, and then the Hawaiian sovereignty movement of the 1990s. And when Hawaiians really took back their identity, reasserted their self-determination, and protested against the bombing of Ka'olawi, the evictions at Kalama Valley of the farmers near Sandy Beach, Oahu. So there was this one organizer. There are many Hawaiian nations vying to be the Hawaiian nation. And Kikuni Blaisdell, who was the organizer of the nation Kapakau, he said, I could be a member of his nation. Anyone of any race could be a citizen, just as had been the case with the original Hawaiian nation, so long as they upheld the values of environmental protection, demilitarization, universal health care, return of public lands, and self-government as an independent nation, not a tribe, designated tribe. I'm sorry for the lecture, but it occurs to me that also today, neither of you would look pure haole to me because there are so many more people who look like you, which speaks to both your theses about, the horrors of the blood quantum for Hawaiian homeland beneficiary status, because we're intermarrying all the time. There's less and less Hawaiian blood all the time, ergo less and less land to be available. Not that any of it has really been made available, like 8% in 100 years. The number of Americans who identified as more than one race doubled to 13.5 million people between 2010 and 2020, according to census figures. 44% of Hawaii-born infants in 2015 were of mixed race or ethnicity, according to the Pew Research Center. Yet few books have been written by authors who identify as mixed race. It's as if we've had to choose our loyalties as authors, just being, like from one entity. And sometimes, like your heroines, we felt rejected by the culture we were raised in, whether it's Jessica's tough, outspoken local girl of color settling between divorced parents, homes in gritty Kalihi or Makakila, or the shy, striving Hi'is, the earnest Hula students, Native Hawaiian upbringing on homestead lands, which are the only family and home she knows. And just one more thing. So there's this woman, Nancy Lopez, director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice at University of New Mexico. She said, it's not what your ancestry is, it's what you look like. That's how discrimination happens. And she said her group puts the word race in quotes to emphasize that race is a shifting concept based more on social norms than biology. So can you speak about how your heroines, being told as children they don't belong to where they know they belong because they look too Howley by other kids, by their own family sometimes, how do they react and cope? For one thing, they both are aware of Hawaiian legend. I mean, in the 90s, people became proud to be Hawaiian, you wanted to learn more. They're inspired by the Hawaiian legends of the shape-shifting mo'o and the powerful self-expressing goddesses, Pele and Hi'iaka. Do Jessica and Hi'i experience shape-shifting themselves, perhaps as a way of escaping from societal norms? Sorry for a long question.
No, I love it. Can I go back for a second? I was thinking about what you said about like this, that one like drop thing you put in there about like, the people who now identify as mixed race in America has doubled in 10 years. And I just think I don't think that there's necessarily more of them, which I'm sure there are. I think it's definitely that people feel more comfortable, like they're understanding that they can be mixed. And there's also options for it. Like, for a long time, you get any questionnaire if you're not in Hawaii, or maybe New York or California, but but normally you get a questionnaire and it's like check a box and there's 5 boxes and you.
I was going to say, I think actually part of that number doubling, it has to do, and I might be wrong, but I think the census it was fairly new where you couldn't, there was the option to have more than one, whereas before you had to pick one.
Yeah, and there was even that one about like even more Native Hawaiians, and it was like, oh, why is there more Native Hawaiians? I'm like, no, people now feel more comfortable identifying. It's not like there's like where they come from, like what I mean. It's like we're always here, and I think that that's good. There's a cultural shift in being able to embrace your own multitudes of identity, right? But yes, okay, back to shapeshifting. Yes, I would say my shapeshifting, not for the best. Like the way that I would escape, right? Like when I was a little kid, I would escape into like, doing little shows or play. Like I lived in my head, right? Like where all my, like I would make up stories, and that was my way of escaping like the tension in my family, or the tension of like the silence in my family, right? And then as I got older and it gets louder, you know what I mean? Like it's a way to silence it was like literally through music, and so I was like, it was the 90s, so I was like a kid that was in the punk rock scene, and I was a little goth kid in Hawaii, right, with like my big black boots and like fishnet stockings, and that's goofy, right? Like screw the beach, like all this dumb stuff, but like and then that transcends into like a lot of drinking that happened right in my college and early 20s. So yeah, I felt like I was always trying to escape, but in a different way, and like and not doing it correctly. Like as one usually does, especially when they're young. They haven't really, figured out what's the best way to sort of cope with things.
Well, and Jasmin, in one part of the novel, it seems that he actually sees her grandmother turning into a mo'o. Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, so part of what I wanted to do in the book, well, let me go back really quickly, because I do think also part of the identification, even with Native Hawaiians, is those questionnaires didn't used to have the option. It didn't used to list Native Hawaiian, so it's like, sometimes when you read about, I have all these papers from my family, like just memories and things like that. And they talk about all the kind of propaganda they used to get when Hawaii was, or when the states were trying to vie for Hawaii to become a state. And they were all this, if the statehood would be great, the statehood would be great. The option wasn't, so you could vote to either become a state or to not be a state. That was it. You could vote to stay a territory or to be a state, not independent, not anything else. And so I think now we're seeing these things because we're asking the questions, so I think that is part of the discomfort, but also part of the travesty of what, like, I always think, I tell people now, I say, I'm writing as a citizen of Hawaii. If not for the occupation, I'd be a citizen of Hawaii. So yeah, we'd still probably be talking about blood, but it would be different. I'd be a citizen. There would be no question of that. And I could claim it in a certain way and just say I'm from Hawaii. Whereas right now it feels very complicated to do that. Although I don't feel like I'm an American, when I first lived in Europe, people would go, oh, not really. When I'd say I'm from Hawaii, they go, oh, American, but not really, but, and as far as like, so going back now to the mo'o question, I think for Hi'i and for anyone that's mixed, we learn, like, survival, it comes through being a chameleon, right? It's like you do shapeshift. You put on, I used to kind of pretend, like I'd watch people's movements and things and just kind of mimic. And so I could just kind of pretend I was this or that. And so for it was like a complete rejection. If I can't be this, if you're saying I'm not this, then I must be, if I'm not X, I must be Y.
I totally love that and understand and agree with all of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, you don't accept me and I'm not part of you. Like if I don't fit this local cliche of what a local girl is supposed to be, well, then I'm going to go all the way off the deep end.
There's no embracing. There's no halfway.
I'm going to be loud. I'm going to be like, I hate Jawaiian. You know what I mean? Like I'm going to,
yeah. And so, I mean, that was one of the most autobiographical things about Hi'i's journey. It's a lot less autobiographical than I thought it was going to be in the end, but that is one of the things where when Hi'i moves to California, it was this complete rejection of her culture and where she's from. And it's like, well, if you're telling me I'm white, I'm just going to go to the land of the white people. And what she learns is like, well, no, you're not that either. It's not that easy. And as far as, her grandmother shapeshifting, I did want to bring in that element of like, in a certain world, that being in the book would be considered magical realism, but not in Hawaii. That's reality. Our myths are, at least the way I grew up, they weren't myths. The Pele is up there, a road. You do these things for her, and it's the reality of things. And so with Hulali being a part of that world, I didn't see it as anything kind of metaphorical almost, it was more of just like, that's part of this place. That's part of the layers of this place. And then also the question of Hi'i's paternity, how much do you believe in Hawaiian mythology? If you believe in mo'o and you believe in the ability to be impregnated by one, well, then isn't Hi'i Hawaiian? And so I did want to leave that there because it's like, okay, well, you either, at a certain point, you either believe in America's definition of what a Hawaiian is, or we got to figure out this other thing, you know.
And then do you think, well, it seems like you both learned to be chameleons, you learned to study other people, just to negotiate the way no teenager wants to be an outsider. No one wants to be different. You have to have some gang, even if it's a mixed gang. He had far less opportunities than Jessica because of the rather closed community in which she lived. But do you think that becoming writers was another form of really healthy shape-shifting in dealing with this sense of rejection you'd felt, or your characters had felt, both from their own families and from society?
Sure, writing is like how I make sense of things. Like, you know, I'm also a journalist, so I have questions. I'm skeptical by nature. Like, you know, my job is to like poke holes and be like, what's this? Well, why is that then? And you know, and I always sort of was like that. And so yeah, I think writing through it, you know, but I will say the funniest thing about it is that like I have been, as an editor, I've been the editor of like identities, verticals, and covering these things for a long time. And I didn't like overly think about why that was for some reason until like I realized I had, you know, covering a lot of racial tension and like, you know, stuff about gender and sexuality like on the continent, but and I had like all this knowledge of like other histories in America, but like it dawned on me at one point, I was like, you know, I don't know if I know enough about my own history, and I need to do this work for myself. And you know, and it's because yeah, I like sort of live in this blurry spot of identity, right? Of like, what am I this, am I that, or where do I fit? And so I think I've always been drawn to that. It's in my work, my daily work. You know, at NBC, I'm on the diversity, equity, and inclusion team, and we, you know, my job is to like publish best practices about like how to cover certain communities better. You know, like I'm all like this. It's all my jam, you know. but yeah, like writing, I think it is definitely something that writing has allowed me to like work through, right, and figure things out.
Yeah, I think I never really considered or aspired to be a writer. I just was a reader, and a large part of why I was a reader was an escape into just different worlds, you know, and that could be mine, where I could own that and have control in it, I guess, and not be questioned. And it was a disassociation. It was, yeah, like my cousins and everybody, they were learning about the different limu and all the things, and I just, no, I'm not gonna, you know, do that or care. And so I think I always felt, and then when I moved to California, it was like, oh, I'm actually not white. Like it was such a culture shock, and I didn't know anything about it, and getting away with looking the way I look, I got a pass a lot, but I had no idea what I was doing, or any, you know, everything went over my head. But I was always on the outside looking in. And I think that is just a writer inherently. We're always kind of looking in the window, you know, and almost not participating, but only by observing or something. And that's kind of, I think, how I started processing or trying to even attempt to make sense of all these confusing things, was like, if I can put it into sentences, if I can find words for this thing, then maybe I'll find some kind of, if not answers, at least some resolution or peace, you know.
Well, thank you. Both your books are vividly seen, deeply perceived, scrupulously observed portraits of people and places that completely captivated me. The characters, I fell in love with them all. I feel you each made your home places real places that I could enter into, but I would never have seen them without you. I've been to Makakilo, never been to Jessica's Makakilo. I've been to Hilo, what? This is incredible. Jasmin's Hilo. We do need to leave some time for questions. I think we might have a couple. Let's see. Question from surprise, Don Wallace. On the mainland, should I read it or can you read it? I'll read it aloud for everyone. On the mainland, in our twisted black-white history, the whites defined black as having even one drop. Prejudice then applied 100%, except in New Orleans, which developed a complicated caste race system. It's a lousy definition because of the history, but should we just move to a one drop definition?
Right. It's funny, right? Those we'll just make up any sort of definition to sort of screw over people however we best can. You know what I mean? Right? If we can enact prejudice and discrimination against them, we'll just make up new rubrics. So if you're Black, then you just need to be one drop, and then we can just be discriminating against you. But if you're Hawaiian, we need to, if you're going to get anything from us, like the land that we stole from you, you need to be this much, then you need to be 50. It's just, it's never in anybody's.
Well, I think the first American document that kind of started this whole blood quantum thing. It was basically white settlers were trying to have expand their ability to claim land. And so if they could say a native wasn't a native, then it wasn't their land. And so the first document, it laid it out where they were like, a native person is more than 50%. And then the second sentence was, if anyone has any African descent, they are chattel. So they're property. And so it was just black and white. If we profit from it, we'll change the rules. And I think for me, as reading about, I actually don't think we should move to a one drop definition. I think we should do what Maoris did. When I learned the most by reading all the literature and all the studies coming out of New Zealand. They completely rejected blood quantum entirely. And it was like a fork in the road for them. There are all these essays and everything that say it was the most destructive thing that they could have possibly kind of tried to survive, precisely because of, Jessica, what you were saying. It was just like, we disqualify ourselves. Do I have enough? I don't. And everybody they were always talking about fractions instead of like, I am Maori. And now they embrace Waka Papa, which is like your ancestral, it's your mo'oku auhau, it's like how we introduce ourselves anyway in Hawaii without even realizing it, right? We go back to our common denominator, and we list all our ancestors and where we're from and all of these things. And that's how they establish who they are. And so even a one drop to me is problematic. Although we've so internalized that it's hard for me to imagine us completely rejecting it the way New Zealand has.
Yeah, I also think about how in Hawaii, we don't talk about any other ethnicity with the percent, the fractions as much as we do about being Native Hawaiian. You don't ever hear anybody be like, I'm 1/8 Filipino. That's just I don't know. It's really pretty much, unless it's half, that's it. But otherwise it's I'm 1/32 Hawaiian, or I'm 1/8 Hawaiian. You get these and that's it. It says so much about how much blood quantum we have internalized. That's how it's it feels like the only one that we talk about in such a manner. Yeah. Whereas the rest you just list them and nobody cares about how much you are, right?
Yeah, the diffidence and humility with which both of you refuse to claim your Hawaiianness, it really breaks my heart. I think we all grew up admiring Hawaiian people. Mm-hmm. Respecting the culture, being so grateful to be taught what we could be taught, and we wanted to be worthy of being Hawaiian. But you are worthy. You are it's crazy, but yeah, it's felt like something you had to earn. But just by virtue of being Hawaiian at all, or even under the Hawaiian Kingdom Constitution, maybe it was like they were pressured by, people from Asia and America, probably. But still, as Kikuni Blaisdell said, anybody can be a citizen of this nation the way that's how it should be, as long as, and you've both spoken to this, as long as you meet your kuleana to perpetuate the culture and the righteousness, that we know the values. I think we might have one more question before we have to. Do we have one more? Uh-oh. Does anyone see it?
Oh,
Okay, cute. I don't see another one. No open questions. All right, so we still have a couple of minutes. So what really broke my heart too and was so human about both your books was how Jessica and Hi'i conflate social and family rejection. I mean, these children are really bereft. The silence of your parents, Jessica, the virtual hatred Hula seems to express towards little Hi'i, whose mother, of course, just adores her. There's a lot of stress and conflict in these families. Children tend to blame themselves. And you've both spoken about the internalization of colonialism, which is a hell of a lot of a burden for children and young people to bear.
Well, I think also there's well, at least we're like island culture, you didn't helicopter parent, and Hulali's generation, which is another thing I tried to encompass, was like, that was a cultural thing. You didn't cry. You were doing your kids a disservice. It was like, no, you toughen them up, and it wasn't your job to be their friend or be nice to them. You just, you got them ready for life. And so I wouldn't even say Hulali didn't like Hi'i. Hulali was in her world. She was like, these are the facts of how things are going to have to be. And that's what's important. That's how things survive. And there's a harshness to it, but there is a fierceness to, I think, island love. There's some bite in it,
There is. We all got slapped in the side of the head by our grandmothers. Plenty.
Yeah, I know. My kids think I'm tough. I'm like, you don't know.
Just one quick.
Yeah.
And then, but you both studied hula growing up, and Hawaiians had oral genealogy. You still have the chants. So did hula and chanting, this means of storytelling and evoking nature, really drawing scenes, did this influence you as writers, help you find words? I mean, what an incredible heritage you both have.
I actually didn't have, like, so I took it when I was like in, this is another story, like, oh man, but like I took hula when I was like 4. It was like the first thing, and then my mom was like, well, no, I want you to take ballet.
Oh,
Oh man. Anyway, but
I think that's also it's a generation.
Yeah, it's a super generational 80s thing. But I took hula as an adult. So like, again, like Zoom hula, like in New York, zooming in to Oregon. So this Kumu who, grew up in Hawaii. Like, it's so
Awesome.
the weird modern way to like anyway, yes. So
no, I mean, like, I wasn't, my mom, my mom's generation, my grandma's generation, they were shamed for speaking pidgin, for being brown, for all these things, so my mom almost, I think as a kid, she was like, you're white, go with it, and so it was like, I wasn't allowed to speak pidgin at home and the ballet stuff. So I totally get that. But I think me dancing hula, part of that was just my family, like, that's what you did, there was no question of it. You got to opt out after a certain amount of, like, if you were a certain age, but there wasn't an opting in, and that was at that time the only way you were going to learn anything about Hawaii. In school, I learned the year it became a state, and that was it. And as far as everything else, relationship with the land, the protocols, all of everything, how to even hold yourself, like who to be when you entered a room was my kumu, and I think that stayed with me all my life. And so when I wrote this, I wrote it in verses. I really did kind of think about it as it's not a book about hula, it's a hula as a book. So very much so. For me, it was very influenced by that form of storytelling, that kind of circular old way of storytelling, but then it's also very place-based, very rooted. You always have to, in Hula, that's one of the things, you always have to know where you're standing, like what direction you're facing, and so I tried to live up to my namesake, at least by writing a book that would be a Hula in a certain way.
Yeah, no pressure is being named after one of the greatest Hula
Yeah.
dancers of all.
I was like, I tell people, I'm like, she like talked to wind, there's no living up to that.
Well, thank you both. I just want everyone on Earth and in the ocean, wherever, to buy these books, these two wonderful, evocative, unique, brilliant books that have moved me so deeply. And I hope listeners today will tell everybody what they heard and feel something. I wanted you to read more from your books, but people not have to just dive in themselves. We do need Roger to do our sign off. And again, thank you, Jessica, Jasmin, and Roger. It's just been such a pleasure and honor to be with you today.
Thank you, Mindy. Such a wonderful conversation.
Mindy, thank you very much. That was a really remarkable conversation. And you should know that it's recorded and the video will be available indefinitely. And once this is over, I'll let you know how to access it. And it will also be on our website. Again, thank you very much. And I'm sure our attendees got it tremendously. They got the texture of your lives beautifully. That was really impressive. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.